With this video, we'll begin our study of the third sublecture, Proverbs 27, verses 23 through the end of that chapter, which is verse 27. We're entitling this A Portrait of Magnificent Management for both courtier and king. We'll begin with an overview of this portion and then consider its preceding and ensuing contexts. Between the extensive second sublecture concerning a courtier's route to magnificence and the fourth sublecture, which will address the king's role, the sage here interjects an illustration, actually an exhortation, cast in terms of animal husbandry. He produces here a positive model of excellence in management. It operates as a bridge between the second and fourth sublectures, since it alludes alike to courtier as well as king. Let's consider the position of this sublecture in the greater context of Proverbs 25 through 29. One element is worth noting that the sage impressed on the pupil toward the close of the second sublecture. Now that second sublecture was 25:13 through 27:22. In the lesson on gaining and giving reproof, that was 27:5 through 18, and also in the concluding section, that's 27:19 to 22, the sage underscored the necessity of self-examination, especially with regard to one's own motives and appetites. By growing aware of his motives in the context of reproof, the sage taught that the courtier may advance toward magnificence. Now, in the present third sublecture, the sage deftly connects to the second by repurposing two terms regarding self-examination and motives. We'll be talking about this under the structures at work in this sublecture. The opening phrase of this sublecture, which reads, "Know thoroughly." This phrase solemnly announces a knowledge priority that will comprise a foundational anchor of wisdom orientation, an anchor whose gravity exceeds that even of self-knowledge or self-examination. Instead of knowing self, the sage now charges the youth to know your flock. What about the ensuing context? After introducing here in the third sublecture a management model drawn from animal husbandry, then in the fourth sublecture the sage will supply his last answer to the question that unifies the entire master lecture. That is, how may a monarchy attain magnificence? That last answer will focus on the monarch, accenting in particular the king's unique role in assuring justice for the wider community. That fourth sublecture spans chapters 28 and 29 of Proverbs. The fourth sublecture will open with a scene of escalating crime, a condition precisely in need of a judge-king who, like the attentive shepherd of this third sublecture, is not so preoccupied with his own opulence, but takes time to, in the words of the first verse of the third sublecture, to know thoroughly the face of his flock. Thus aware of oppressive conditions in his community, the wise king will be able to intervene and remove negative elements, precisely as was prefigured as far back as the first sublecture in chapter 25, verse 5. Let's read through the translation of this portion, Proverbs 27, 23 through 27. Notice that ahead of verse 23, we're offering the following major heading: Introduction, Imperative and Rationale concerning Asset Management. Know thoroughly the face of your flock. Focus your motives on your herd. For wealth does not last forever, and certainly not a crown from one generation to the next. And now section 2, which we're entitling Strategy and Rationale for Successful Asset Management. Grasses had vanished, yet new growth appeared, and the luscious mountain vegetation was gathered. Lambs for your clothing, and he-goats for the purchase of a field, and she-goats' milk is sufficient for food for you and food for your household, bringing life to your young maidens. Now let's turn to explore some structures that give shape to this sublecture. Before exploring macrostructural features, it will be important to note several links that join this sublecture with the entire master lecture. There are 7. A. Magnificence. B. Monarchy. C. The term face, which in Hebrew is panim. D. The term motives. In Hebrew, that's the word lave. E. Fruitfulness through farming. F. Sufficiency. And finally, G. Foresight. Consider first, then, magnificence. The statement that we find here in verse 24, that wealth is susceptible to diminishment, indicates that this teaching is interested in sustaining a certain level of opulence or magnificence. 24 reads, "For wealth does not last forever, nor a crown from one generation to the next." In verse 26, mention of expanding one's farming business through purchasing a field similarly speaks to economic success. These elements recall then the theme of magnificence, evident both in the first and second sublectures through terms such as glory and through the mention of precious metals. The next master lecture link is the monarchy. Concern for the durability of a monarchy was established in the first sublecture. We can see this in 25, verse 5. That concern resurfaces here when the sage observes that a crown may not be depended on to persist as a permanent asset. That's here in verse 24. In addition, mention of animal husbandry in verses 23 and 26 within the context of a master lecture that deals periodically with the monarchy. This would have evoked the metaphor of a king as shepherd, at least in the minds of some among the sage's original audience. The next link involves the term face, which in Hebrew is panim. The term face grew in significance across the second sublecture. Let's briefly review that. Initially, it captured a husband's display of antisocial sentiment as he presented to his wife an indignant face. That's 25-23. Clearly, here was a trait that the husband needed to get under control, perhaps with the help of a friend, a confidant, that he could trust enough to permit him to improve his own character, to sharpen his face through caring and candid reproof. We see this in 27:17. And character improvement reaches its pinnacle when individuals mature to the level of self-awareness, particularly as they become able to scrutinize their own motives, just as one would study the likeness of his own face as it is reflected in a calm pool of water. We see this in 27:19. Here in the third sublecture, the sage calls on the youth to execute a strategic shift of focus. As crucial as is self-awareness, that's emphasized in 27:19, this remains insufficient if he is to achieve success, whether as courtier or as king. Instead, he must learn to study carefully a different sort of face, namely that of his wealth-generating livestock, That's the message of 27:23, the opening verse of this third sublecture. The critical nature of this shift of focus, the sage underscores by the expression, know thoroughly, opening verse 23. The sage's decision to employ here a grammatical intensification that is so rare in Proverbs, but common elsewhere in Hebrew, suggests that the point which the sage is about to make looms very large in the landscape of this entire master lecture. The grammatical intensification involved here is a paronomastic infinitive, a feature that occurs only once elsewhere within Proverbs. In contrast to lesser objects that the youth's mind might fixate upon, such as a base interest in self-promotion, we saw this in 25:6 and 27:2, or even a noble interest in self-examination, 27:19, the sage here at the outset of this third sublecture urgently directs the youth to become fully aware of the condition of the flock under his care. This forceful opening propels the entire sublecture to a high level of intensity. The next link, operating at the level of the master lecture, involves the term motives, which in Hebrew is lave. The sage developed the connotation of lave as motives in the second sublecture. There we find that wrong motives poison otherwise beneficial undertakings by converting them into agents of malice, whether a song sung to a neighbor, that's in 25:20, or the pursuit of ostensibly just redress in a court setting, 26:23. Given the insidious hazard posed by wrong motives, it is not surprising to find the sage, toward the close of the second sublecture, targeting inner motives as the most important focus of one's self-awareness, more important even than awareness of one's outer countenance. We find that in 27:19, Part B. It is significant that both panim, face, and lave, motives, appear within the same opening verse of the third sublecture, that is verse 23 of chapter 27. Normally the expression sheet lave that is found here, which literally means to place one's mind, normally it would be rendered to focus one's attention on something. However, in order to retain the connotation of lave as motives, as developed through the preceding sublecture, here we are rendering sheet lave as focus your motives on something. The youth now must reject those earlier base motives, both of self-absorption that led to community violence. We saw this in 25, verses 16-20, and also of pernicious litigation. That was in 26:17 through 28. In place of these, he must install this new aim, namely to align all his actions so that they advance not himself, but the well-being of his herds, that is, those under his care. The next structure that operates at the level of the master lecture involves the concept of fruitfulness through farming. Late in the second sublecture, the sage noted that efforts invested in caring for a fig tree would reward the farmer with nourishing fruit. That appears in chapter 27, verse 18. The principles of fruitfulness that follow attentive farming, the sage now expands considerably in this third sublecture as he instructs concerning wise management. Here, crops and flocks that yield clothing to wear, milk to drink, and funds to buy additional fields for him to farm, all of these combine to present a picture of effective management. Notice especially chapter 27, verses 23 and 25 through 27. Farming, whether nurturing fruit trees or here nourishing flocks, is not the first industry metaphor that the sage has employed in this master lecture. In the first sublecture, he drew from the craft of silversmithing, especially the process of refining raw ore, in order to describe the monarch's responsibility for removing ethically inferior elements from society. This appears in 25, verses 4 and 5. Even the art of dispensing reproof within a context of receptivity, the sage likened to the jeweler's craft of composing together exquisite elements of artistry. This appears in 25, verses 11 and 12. The metaphor of farming adds a crucial dimension to these pictures of managerial responsibility portrayed by metallurgist and jeweler. For metallurgist and jeweler generate value by direct manipulation of the final product, independent of any assistance. The refined metal or the intricate piece of jewelry issues directly from his hands without an intermediary. In the case of animal husbandry, however, the farmer produces wool and milk only in an indirect fashion. His is the responsibility to ensure conditions necessary for others, that is, his herds, to do what they do naturally, namely, grow wool, produce offspring, and yield milk. Thus, while a monarch must remove ethical detractors from his realm, as a metallurgist removes impurities through refinement, we discover in this third sublecture that the focus of managerial activity of purification serves a greater purpose. The larger aim, like that of a shepherd, is to provide for the well-being of those who are the actual wealth producers, and that is not the monarch, but the flocks. The next structure operating at the level of the master lecture involves sufficiency. The concept of sufficiency, seen in 27:27, provides a positive aim for supply and consumption. This matches the positive exhortation seen earlier in 25:16. That read, "You found some honey? Eat what you need, lest you eat your fill of it and vomit it up." The term need in 25:16, eat what you need, is the same Hebrew rendered sufficient in 27:27. And let's read that verse. "And she-goat's milk is sufficient for food for you and food for your household, bringing life to your young maidens." Closely related to sufficiency is the theme of being satisfied, a theme the sage underscored by double usage back in 27:20 in the preceding sublecture. At that point, he was delivering a conclusion. The conclusion spanned 27:19 to 22, and this wrapped up the entire second sublecture, which began in 25:13. That sublecture spent considerable time counseling courtiers to maintain tight reins over tendencies toward greedy dissatisfaction, if they were truly interested in ever attaining magnificence. Among various longings that would test a courtier's self-control over such greed, the lust for praise loomed largest. That appeared in 25, verses 6 and 7, in 27, verse 2, and 27:21. Failing self-control over greed, courtiers would remain at the mercy of their desires, which, like Sheol, refuse ever to be satisfied. And that's expressed in 27:20. The present sublecture on farming maps a solution to such Sheol-like perpetual dissatisfaction. The solution comes as one breaks the trance-like fixation on wants that the sage exposed in 27:20. There he wrote, "The eyes of a mortal will not be satisfied." Rather, one must resolutely know thoroughly the face of your flock. 27:23. A knowledge made possible only by directing the gaze away from personal desires, choosing instead to study the well-being of one's livestock. The last structure operating at the level of the master lecture involves foresight. The principle that undergirds reproof, and that undergirds all wisdom for that matter, the sage posited in the preceding lecture, 27:12. And that is the ability to anticipate and therefore evade impending doom. The same theme of foresight marks the caution against vanishing wealth and an impermanent crown here in the present sublecture. We see that in 27:24. There, in the previous sublecture, foresight fueled administering reproof designed to rescue an inattentive friend. Now in this sublecture, foresight serves one's own self, stirring the wise person to labor diligently at his farm. Yet the sage realized that even foresight has its limits. One must give up boasting, he teaches, about tomorrow, for one cannot know, notice that verb, one cannot know what it may bring. We saw that in 27 verse 1, which appeared within one of the recaps of the second sublecture. As if to offset those limitations of future knowledge, when the sage next uses the root for knowing, here in this third sublecture, he will concentrate on what a manager is truly able to apprehend, now in the present. And so we read in 27:23, "Know thoroughly the face of your flock." And in that situation, the root meaning know, yada in Hebrew, appears twice. In the next video, we'll take up macro and microstructural features that operate within this third sublecture.